Nuke's viewer is probably the most important aspect of Nuke because it actually allows you to see what you're working on. The viewer, which is the main panel up here, is also represented in the node graph by this viewer node right here. If you do not have that viewer node, what you're going to see is an empty view. But you can see we can create a brand new viewer simply by clicking over here on the image class nodes and bringing up viewer, and that will create a viewer node. Or if you select the read node and hit the 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. key, you will automatically create a viewer and connect it via the arrow. This input indicates that we have viewer 1. You can see the title in the tab up here, viewer 1, and it's connected to it. If we disconnect it by clicking on the tail, you can see it's no longer displaying that image. Let's click it again. There we go. Now up in the viewer, what we're going to do here is we're going to use the space bar. When you hit the space bar over the viewer, it will make the viewer take over the entire interface. It will zoom it in. In fact, that space bar will also take you back out. And if you're in another area, such as the node graph, the spacebar will zoom in on the node graph and expand it full size. So let's go back to the viewer because that's what we're here for. Now, we're also going to talk about there's a H key and an F key. F will fit the view, leaving a buffer around the image, and H will zoom it to the extent. I use H most of the time. Now, in the viewer, there's a couple important things to realize that the viewer is communicating to you immediately. First of all, this dotted gray line that goes around the entire image is the active resolution. And what I mean by that is the lower right-hand corner says HD 1080. That is the resolution of the current project. We can change that in the default project settings. In the upper right-hand corner is the pixel resolution in the upper right-hand corner. This actually means it's 1920 pixels wide by 1080 tall, right there. Now, if you transform this image and make it larger, it's going to look different. And I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to go out. We're going to put a transform node after this right here. And we're going to scale it up just a little tiny bit by 1.2. And what I want you to see is notice that now the upper right hand corner number has changed. It's now 2115 by 1191. And the lower left hand corner is in negative values, negative 195 and negative 111. This dotted line is called the bounding box. That means the image is actually scaled larger than the resolution format. And you can see this visually in the viewer. This is very important because if you do a lot of transformations on a lot of different images, all this extra bounding box can slow down your rendering times. So always keep your eye on things like that. I'm going to reset this and we're going to move on. I'm going to hit the D key to disable that node so we don't have to look at it. Now, down across the bottom, this is the playback bar. I'm on the timeline and I can click anywhere else on the timeline to go immediately to that frame. We can also go to frames by clicking into this middle field right here and typing the frame number we want, and that will also jump. I can hit play and it will play forward, stop. I can hit play and it'll play backwards. We can stop it there. We can single frame ahead, click by click. This is also advanced to the next keyframe, go to the end of the sequence, and then the two outer areas, this is an I and an O that allows us to set a in point and an out point. And then when we play, what it'll do is it'll play in that zone, in that clip region. This lets you isolate a particular area. Now, another thing you can do is when you are playing it back is use this over here, which is the interaction of what it will do when it gets to the end. By default, it's set to repeat. meaning that it will loop over and over. Now, if I do bounce, what will happen is it'll ping pong forward, back, forward, back. And then I can drop down to stop, where when it gets to the end, it simply stops. Or we can hit continue, where it will play that area, but then ignore the out point and continue past it. I usually leave it on the default, but when I'm working on something that I really need to see, I will set it to bounce. Now you can also adjust the in and out points by clicking on the timeline, hovering over it, and you can stretch it out and move it directly on the timeline. If you want to turn these off, go all the way over to the right and click this icon over here, and that will return it to its normal playback. Now, all the way over here, you'll see a funny little area where there's a 10 in there. And what that does is it jumps 10 frames on the timeline, 10 more frames. And you can put whatever value you want in here. So we'll switch this to 20. And now it will skip every 20th frame. Now, this is really useful for when you're trying to do roto or check a sequence in a regular interval. Now, all the way to the left and the right extents are our frame range. This shot is set up to start on frame 1 to 300. There are 300 frames. However, this clip is only 200 frames. So if you want, we get to around 200 and I hit the playback or play forward, what you're going to see is that the sequence comes to a halt. And that's because there are no more frames. It's being held after that. So one thing that you can do is you can see that we have this global time frame right here. If I click on the drop down, we can switch from global to input. And the input will read the in and out frame range from the read node and switch the timeline to that. And if you have a bunch of clips in your comp that have different in and outs, this is really handy feature to be looking at each read node. Now, right next to that is the frame rate. Now, it's set to 24 frames per second, and you can see after a couple of flips, it will lock into showing 24. But there are other options. So if you're doing a high frame rate project where you need to see it running at 60 frames per second, you can try to see how fast your machine will lock into that frame rate. It looks like my machine is peaking at like maybe 48 and it's going down. So let me stop that and we'll try 15 frames per second, but you can see that will give you a playback rate that is whatever your project is. I almost always leave mine at 24. Right above here is information about the image. You can see it says HD 1080, 1920 by 1080. It gives you bounding box info and the bounding box size. The channels are RGB. There is no alpha channel in this particular image. And over here is coordinates. So as you move the mouse around, it gives you X and Y positional data for where the mouse is. If I hold down the Control or Command on Mac key and left click, I can select a single pixel. And it shows me over here, that is the location of that single pixel. And if we zoom way in, you can see a red box wherever you click. Now, I can also Control Shift left click, and that will let me draw out a box shape that will average the pixels together and also give me a measurement. And you can see it shows that it is 5 pixels by 2 pixels tall. Right next to that is the RGB and alpha channel information for each pixel, the average color, and hue, saturation, value in luma of those pixels. And we can also change this last area here from HSVL to none or 8-bit or log space color. Now let's turn this thing off by doing a control right click, and that will get rid of that selection. And I'm going to hit the H key and go back. Now let's take a tour of the top of the 2D viewer. At the very top, you can see here's the tab that allows us to know that we are looking at viewer 1. You can, of course, click on that and you can drag it out and move it somewhere else if you want to, but we'll just leave it there for now. Next to it is the channels. So these are the channels that we have to select from. We can put it to none and it will not display any. RGB, and it will only display RGB. So even if your image has an embedded alpha channel, you will not be able to see the alpha channel if this is selected to RGB. So that's a very important thing. It defaults to RGBA, and those are the usual channels that you'll be allowed to see. And then there's alpha. So if I select alpha, we can see that there is no alpha. I'm going to switch this up to a sequence that has more than RGB and A. Now before we were looking at the composited version of this monster. Now we are using the render that came direct out of Modo. And you can see it doesn't look as nice. But if we go up here and we look at the drop down, you can now see that there are far more channels available than just RGB and A. There's now ambient occlusion. There is diffuse color output. We also have reflections. Looks like that's a incidence angle reflection. We have UV coordinates. We have all sorts of other types of layers. And you can also see at the bottom info that before where it said channels were just RGB, now it shows depth, ambient occlusion, yada, 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 all the way down. So the viewer is communicating lots of information to us. The next drop down is the channels that are available. So the channels that are available are all the subsets of the initial one. So when we're looking at RGBA and all of these other things, you'll notice that now in this one, they are broken down into RGBA.red, .green, .blue, .alpha, and so on and so forth. So you can see what is all there. Now finally, all the way over here where you see RGB, this is actually the display layer that is going to show in the viewer. Right now it's showing us RGB, but if we want to see what the alpha channel looks like, we can select it. Or the red channel, green channel, blue channel, luminance, or matte overlay. Now all of these have keyboard shortcuts. RGB, A, Y, and M. So I'm going to use those now. So if I hit A again for alpha, it'll return back to RGB. If I hit R, that's showing me the red channel expressed in a black and white display. Then I'm going to go green, blue, and if I hit blue again, it returns back to RGB. If I hit M for matte overlay, what this is showing you is it's very similar to like Photoshop when you paint an alpha channel in Photoshop, how it has that rubylith red overlay color. Well, here it's displaying that alpha channel overlaid onto the RGB as this pinkish red overlay. So you can see how the alpha channel lines up with your RGB layers. Hit M again and it'll go away. And if I hit the Y key, that is going to give me the luminance, the brightest pixels, but not of the channel, but of all the channels combined. So let's return back to RGB. The next one that's grayed out is called IP, or input process. That's something that we're going to cover in the color chapter. And that can be a node or a set of nodes that is inside of Nuke that changes the way the viewer looks for kind of like a LUT, which is what the next drop down is, which these are the LUTs. Right now, most of the time, we look at sRGB. Main reason why sRGB is the LUT that is the default is because all monitors, all computer monitors, all TVs, laptops, display devices, tablets, you name it, use an sRGB viewer process to interpret the pixels and display them. This has gone way, way back. There are some high-end monitors that allow you to display differently, but in essence, what you can do is you can drop this down to other types of LUTs, such as Rec 709 or 1886, or no LUT whatsoever, and apply a LUT separately to manage the color. But typically, you're going to be looking at this through sRGB, unless you're using linear plates that will be displayed through a color process called a LUT. Now, directly below this slider and this slider, this is gamma, the Y right here, and the 1 in this slider, that's all gamma, and this is all gain. And what this allows you to do is to gain up the image, or gain it down, or gamma up, or gamma down. And this is particularly useful for keying and other color operators because sometimes you need to work in the dark pixels and you can't see things very clearly, so you gamma up and you can pull detail out of the darkest areas. What's really important to understand about these controls up here is that once you move it away from the default value of 1, you'll notice that it turns red. If you click on this, it'll toggle back to 1. And if I click on it again, it'll toggle back to whatever value I slid it to. This allows you to quickly look at the image, toggle that overexposure gamma up, and then toggle back down. These are viewer-only display changes. They do not affect the image when you render it out. It's literally like turning the brightness up on your monitor, or turning the contrast down, or turning the brightness up. And speaking of which, you'll notice that the gain has a f-stop over here. Oftentimes you'll hear somebody say, oh, I want to see that 2 stops darker or 2 stops brighter. Well, it's really easy because over here with the f-stop, you can just go click, click, and now that is literally 2 stops brighter, 3 stops brighter, 4 stops brighter. Click the f-stop again and it goes back to default. And then you can do the same thing in the opposite direction and darken it by a certain number of stops. This next part up here at the very top middle, these are your A buffer and your B buffer. And what that means is that if we go back to the node flow, I could take another sequence, like say the original background, and connect it to a second input on the viewer. So you can see now I have the composited image coming in on input 1, and the background just by itself, the back plate, coming in on input 2. So let's go back here, and you'll see it says A is read 16, and the reformat, which is the background, I can select and it'll show that. Now what's great about having the 2 inputs is that we can now do things with those inputs, and that's what this middle drop down is. And we'll default to wipe. So wipe allows each buffer to exist so we can wipe back and forth and we can see what has changed between the two. And we can compare whether colors have changed or other things have changed. You can kind of see the background back here has changed because there are roads and things that were painted out and removed in the background, and the background was rebuilt, as well as the monster being put in. You can rotate this to any angle, and this little handle right here changes the opacity, so you can change the opacity of the two to compare. So that's the wipe, but we can also use a stack. You can also use a stack where you can stack the two images, and right now they're going under each other or over each other or minus, and now it subtracts one from the other. Or you can also use onion skin, which kind of takes a maximum average of different layers and compares them against each other. So if you want to turn this off, go back to the dash line at the top, and that will return you to just the A buffer, and you can switch whichever A buffer you are using. Now, way over here, we're going to look at these little icons, and you can see right here, this is a safe zone. And right now, none of these are turned on. You can toggle title safe, action safe, format center, and format resolution. Now, this used to be a big deal when dealing with television because CRT tubes, the old TVs that existed before HD, typically had this outer edge went like underneath the plastic molding or the bezel of the television. So you'd never want to have any titles or text that bled out of this inner box, and no important action go out of the action safe, which is the middle box right here, this section here, because you would always lose this very last bit. Now, it's true that this is also necessary in respect to modern TVs because they don't have as severe cropping, and as well as movie theaters, they don't crop the image as severely, but always it's a good idea to keep any titles that you have inside the middle box, actions inside this box, and just kind of disregard this outer box. That doesn't mean you don't make it look good, because these days we put demo reels, we put a lot of our content, and hell, we'd even do a lot of projects that are delivered on the internet where people watching them on computers see the full frame edge to edge. So you always want to make everything look good, but that's what this is for. So to that end, the next one is for film, and this is basically letterboxing in different aspect ratios. This image is 16 by 9, so if I put up a 16 by 9 guide, it's not going to really look any different. But the 2 to 235 to 1 right here, if I select this and then I select how I want it to be displayed, this is the lines, or you can have half darkened or fully black. This has now added a 2 to 3.5 to 1 aspect ratio, which is often associated with Panavision movies or CinemaScope. Puts that letterbox onto your image. Again, this doesn't get rendered into your composite. It's merely a guide, so you can go, hey, I see where the important information is, and I can deal with that. So I usually, when I have this being used, I usually use it as half opacity so I can still see things. So we're going to go back to none. And the next button right here, this is for exposure warnings. Now, and it's also called zebra striping for obvious reasons. That will be more apparent in a moment, because my image right here doesn't really have problems with exposure. So we're going to force it to have a problem with exposure by really overexposing, by cranking up the gain. And you can see that by clicking on this, anywhere where pixels are very overexposed, meaning that they're pretty much above a value of 1, you can see that it's now showing these zebra stripes, as they call them, through that area. Again, this isn't doing this to the image. The image, when I turn the warning stripes off, it's there. But these pixels are now way above 1. And in fact, if we look all the way down to the right, you can see that the red channel is 2.5, green is 3.3, blue is 1.39, all above 1. This is, again, has been if you're working in film, you typically are working in a higher bit range where it's okay to have values over 1 because a colorist in a DI session is going to manipulate the color and bring it into their distribution profile. But it used to be that we would have to be very careful in broadcast television to make sure that our values were within a 0 to 1 safety range. Otherwise, they would get clipped. They would get dull. I remember years ago seeing commercials on TV where the high ranges, somebody at the station just clipped them to gray, and it made it look terrible. And you would never want some engineer at a TV station deciding how your images are going to look. So that's what this is here for. You probably won't use this if you're doing film work because, again, we work at a higher bit depth. And more, we're doing film work for Netflix and streaming platforms where they're distributing their content at 4K with HDR, which is high dynamic range, because televisions can now handle this. So more and more, you're probably never going to deal with this. Okay, so now the next one over here, this is our proxy mode. And by toggling on proxy, it's going to do one of two things. Either it's going to use the auto proxy setup that Nuke has, or it's going to use an alternate proxy loading system. Now, when I go to the read node, you can see over here that it's reading in this sequence from my desktop, but there's also another read panel right here for proxy. The proxy is a pre-rendered lower resolution file. So if you're working on some insane resolution, or even maybe not so insane, like 4K, but you're working on a machine that just can't handle 4K real-time playback, you might create down-resed proxies of your work files. You put them into here, and then you can toggle between full res and proxy res with this button. And that allows a lower end machine to work faster and more efficiently, even if it doesn't have like 128 gigs of RAM. Now, there's also auto proxy, and the auto proxy comes in over here where you can see that it says 1 to 1. That means every 1 pixel is being represented by 1 pixel. If we go 1 to 2, it's now taking every other pixel and just dropping them away. If I go 1 to 4, every 4th pixel is disappearing. And slowly but surely, as we go down, this starts to look like an old school 8-bit video game. But if you get down to these really small resolutions, the image will look better at a smaller size. But again, it's about speed and playback. If you have a really ridiculous resolution image, this can help speed things up. So I'm going to turn all of this back to 1 to 1, turn that off, and there we go. Now the next thing over here, this is a full frame processing stack. Now what this means is if I were to be zoomed in and I hit playback, you see how it creates that orange bar at the bottom. That means it's being cached into RAM. That's terrific because when it's in RAM, it can play back much smoother. I can scrub through it. But if I zoom back out and show the whole image, notice that that bar completely went away. That's because Nuke only loaded the pixels necessary to display them into the viewer. By switching this on to full frame processing means that no matter where you are zoomed in or zoomed out and you make a change, the entire frame is being processed at the same time. So now when I zoom out, it doesn't lose the cache. It stays cached in RAM. This can be very handy for certain types of scenes that are heavy, but mainly this is turned off because it helps speed up workflow. The next button over here is to refresh the frame. This is kind of like re-rendering the frame. Every once in a while, Nuke gets stuck on something, or it doesn't seem like it took that last little change you did to the blur node. you might come up here and click this, and it will force Nuke to recalculate the entire frame. This next icon right here is called the region of interest, or ROI. Now, this creates a little box, and you can click and move this box around, and this will focus all of Nuke's computational power in just that window. That window is the only thing that updates. Notice that as I play the sequence, only what's in the region of interest is what's flipbooking. If I move this over here, now it's only that part. So this way, if I can, again, if you have large, heavy comp, but need to focus on a particular area, say we were just working on the spit inside of his mouth or his eyes or the glint on the skin in the face, we wouldn't need to calculate everything over here while we were working on that. And it allows us to be more efficient and faster in our work. All right, so to toggle this back off, we just go up to the bar and turn off ROI, and now you see the frame entirely refreshes. Right next to it, those two tall vertical bars, those are literally a pause button. What that means is it's a pause button for the viewer. The viewer is on pause. It will not refresh. If I hit the playback, notice it's not updating. If I have any nodes that I'm tweaking, they will not update. The pause button often is a saving grace, because there's been many times where I've had a very heavy comp where something, a RotoPaint or a tracker node or something is calculating and it won't display the image. And you just know a crash is coming. If you can pause the viewer, it basically puts a stop to that. And also, if you cancel some certain nodes, like a 2D tracker, if you cancel it, Nuke automatically pauses the viewer. And suddenly after that, if you don't realize that red pause mark is happening up there, you could be working along going, why isn't anything working? Oh my God, nothing's working. Well, that's because the viewer's paused. So if you want it to work, unpause it. And look, now it works. Now, right next to that, this is the zoom level. And you can see, here's the keyboard shortcuts for different zoom levels. There's our fit and the H key for fit by height. And then there's also a plus and minus for zoom in and zoom out. If you want to see this at 100%, you can hit Control 1, and that will make sure that you're seeing 1-to-1 pixels with your monitor. We already covered the dynamic downres, and you have a eyedropper. If you click that, it will allow us to dynamically see everything. See how the things are updating in the lower right. If that's turned off, it just gets rid of the info bar completely. Turn it on, your info bar is there. And then right over here is our selection types. We have rectangular selection, which is what we've always been seeing, but Nuke 12 also adds elliptical selection and lasso. Everybody loves the lasso. Now we're going to go from the 2D viewer to the 3D viewer, because Nuke is a 2D compositor, but it has a whole 3D backend that we can generate 2D elements for out of 3D assets. By going over here and selecting 3D, we are now in the 3D viewer, and this adds a couple of options. First of all, we previously covered we can zoom in, middle mouse click and drag lets us pan, Control or Command on Mac with the left click, which will allow us to orbit our 3D view. So I'm going to pop out. We're going to move our viewer over here to our 3D troll. Now, I have the troll inside of here, our monster, in 3D, And he was brought in out of Maya as an Alembic file. And that's one of the really cool things you can do with Nuke is you can bring in Alembics. And if I zoom out, you can see, oh, there he is. And he's a full 3D piece of geometry, fully animated just like the 2D renders. And we can do a lot of really cool things in 3D. But let's talk about the viewer. So you can see we can select the mesh and it'll show us the polygons. We can also notice that it's pretty much the same, but these features over here have changed and been added. So right here, this is a headlamp. What that means is to the camera, they parent a lamp that illuminates the geometry. With this on, it'll give you some shading. With it off, it's basically unshaded constant color, meaning that it has no value from highlight to shadow. So sometimes putting this on will reveal the shape and the form a lot better. Now we can put other lights in here, but that's a bigger topic. This next icon over here is the grid. So the grid that's on the ground, which shows us our orientation of which way our y-axis, z-axis, and x-axis are pointing, we can toggle that on and off. Sometimes it gets confusing to see that, and visibility, we want to turn it off. And then there's a camera. So you can see it says it's a default camera. That's the camera that we're rotating around. We can also create new cameras. So if we like a particular angle, like this, and we move our view to that, if we click on this and say create camera, that literally created a camera in that exact position that we were just looking at. And by going over here and then switching the view to that new camera we created, it goes right back to that view. Now the icon next to it locks that camera. It locks it to the frame. So now when I pull out and try to rotate, rotation won't work. I can zoom in and zoom out, but notice that within the frame, his face does not change. There's no parallax. This is essentially kind of like you're zooming in and zooming out with a telephoto lens. If I click this again, it's unlocked. If I do that now, see how it's definitely changing and I can rotate. Let's go back to that camera. And if I hold down the control key and click again, it's now green. If that icon is green, what that means is the camera that I'm looking through is now editable, and I can click and drag and move the position that I'm looking through. And that's actually updating the position of that camera. So when I go back and lock it to that position, it's now in that new position. So let's get out of those cameras, and we will zoom out, position our in a different way, and go to the next thing right here, which is node selection. So this is our selection styles. There is node selection, vertex, face, object. So if I go to node, when I click on this, what I'm actually selecting is the node. So let me zoom out, and I want you to see in my script that when I click on the Trolls object, the Alembic read file is what is selected. When I click off of it, it's unselected. If I select the camera that we created, which is right here, is what's selected. And that's what it means by node selection. It is literally selecting the node in the node graph when you select the 3D object. Now I'm going to go down to vertex selection. With vertex selection, it is showing all the points or vertices in the geometry, and I can click and drag and select. And there are other tools in Nuke that allows me to do things with these selections, but that's what this is doing for the viewer. It allows me to actually select the vertices. Let's go to face selection, and I think you know where we're going with this. This allows us to select the individual polygons or faces of the object. And then lastly, there is object selection. So this particular troll is made out of sub-objects. So I can select these sub-objects such as his skin, the horns, the rocks on his back, his teeth, his tongue. They're all separate objects. So that allows me to do object-based selection. Now, if we go to vertex selection again, and I go to select the vertexes, and then rotate around, I want you to see that it did not select through his body because it detects occlusions. It knows that those vertices are being occluded by his forward shoulder, and therefore you cannot see them, you cannot select them. If I go down and select Disable Occlusion Testing, now it does not see occlusions, and if I do that same move and select that area, when I go to rotate, you can see that it is selected through his shoulder, all the backside vertices all the way through. And that can be very handy if you're trying to select a certain specific group. So we're going to turn that back off. And the next guy over here, this is actually a soft selection toggle. So that'll give you a fall off for when you select. You can see how the brightness of the pixels of the selections are falling off. And that gives you a nice weighted style selection set. And then of course we also have rectangular selection, ellipse selection, and lasso. So we have those in here as well for selecting. And the last little bit in the 3D viewer is, of course, we were in 3D, but all these other views are 3D as well. So we can see the back, front, bottom, top, right side, left side, or 3D gives us a perspective view. And if at any time we want to go back to 2D, we just hit Tab, and that will take us back to our 2D view, and we can go back to our 2D images. So that wraps up our little tour of the viewer. The viewer is one of the most important, if not the most important part of Nuke, because without it, we're blind in what we can do in Nuke. It is the main display that shows us what is the result of our nodes, what is the result of how we interact with our images, and how we put them together.